The ruins stood like a skeleton of glass and iron beneath the bruised light of dawn, their fractured panes glittering with dew as though the night itself had wept in silence. I had been summoned to the outskirts of Kensington at the very hour when even the milkmen were scarce upon their routes, and there I found Holmes kneeling amidst the crooked ribs of what had once been a grand conservatory. The place carried an unnerving stillness. No bird song, no rustling leaves, only a faint creak where a twisted beam shifted with the morning's chill. Charred soil stretched across the marble walkway, and though the fire brigade had long since departed, the scent of burned varnish lingered like a warning unheeded. Holmes did not greet me when I arrived. He merely gestured for silence, his eyes fixed on a peculiar spray of blackened glass shards arranged in a pattern too deliberate to be accidental. I felt an odd discomfort then, an intuition rather than reason, that the destruction around us was not the culmination of tragedy, but its prelude. There was a broken lantern near the threshold, a lady's glove caught beneath a fallen trellis, and footprints half obliterated by ash, leading nowhere. If this account should reach curious minds beyond the smoke-stained morning in which it began, let them understand that what follows is no ordinary chronicle of deduction, but an entanglement of memory, rumor, and dark corners London prefers to overlook. Should they find value in these recollections, I trust they will remain attentive, for the truth was not revealed in a single stroke, but in fragments of glass and whispered shadows across the days that followed. The summons came with such abruptness that I had barely fastened my collar before I found myself jolting through the paling streets in a hansom, the air still holding the damp chill of a London night not yet entirely surrendered to dawn. Holmes had sent only a brief note, scrawled in his incisive hand and delivered by a dishevelled messenger who looked as though he had been routed from sleep. Kensington, Conservatory ruin, come at once. Bring a clear mind. It was all, and yet it was more than enough to tell me that some singular occurrence had disturbed his habitual composure. By the time I stepped down from the cab, the sky held the faintest wash of grey, and the house that loomed before me bore the melancholy dignity of a place accustomed to more cheerful purposes than those of the constable. The conservatory lay to one side, or rather, what remained of it, a gaunt framework of iron and shattered panes that caught the meagre light and fractured it into 100 mournful glints. The smell of burned wood and scorched earth clung to the air with the persistence of some invisible spectre. A constable at the gate recognized Holmes's name upon my lips and admitted me without further question. Within the ruined conservatory, I beheld my friend already at work, as much a part of that strange scene as any fallen beam or twisted length of metal. He was kneeling upon the blackened tiles, his tall, lean figure bent in an attitude of absolute concentration, the brim of his hat casting a sharp shadow over his eyes. He did not turn when I approached, but lifted one hand in a silent request for patience. In the stillness, I became acutely aware of small, incongruous sounds. The very faint drip of moisture from some unseen height, the occasional distant rattle of a passing cart in the street beyond, and the almost imperceptible creak of heated metal contracting with the morning's chill. It was only when I drew near that I perceived the object of his attention. A scatter of glass lay before him, yet not the ordinary debris of shattered panes. These fragments had gathered as if by design into a peculiar, radiating pattern, their edges not uniformly clear, but tinged, in many cases, with a subtle violet hue that was visible even in the uncertain light. Holmes's long fingers hovered just above them, measuring by eye the distance between one shard and the next, his lips compressed in that thin line I knew so well, a sign not of irritation, but of intense mental activity. "You observe, Watson," he said at last, without looking up, how destruction, when guided by accident alone, tends to chaos, whereas here we see the ghost of deliberate intention. "I confess," I replied, "that I see only glass and ruin. You speak of intention. Do you mean that this fire was no mere misfortune?" He rose then, slowly, and I saw that his cuffs were smudged with ash. His gaze swept the length of the conservatory, taking in the scorched iron ribs, the collapsed trellis, and the charred stumps of once luxuriant plants. Fire, my dear fellow, is no respecter of beauty, yet it is rarely so discriminating as this. Note that the blaze has devoured parts of the structure entirely, while leaving others merely blackened, as though it met here with a force that did not consent to be easily conquered. Before I could frame a question, a shuffle of feet announced the approach of a uniformed figure. A middle-aged man in constable's attire, his face lined by long service and a night without rest, halted at a respectful distance. "Begging your pardon, sir, are you Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" Holmes inclined his head. "I am. And this is my friend and associate, Dr. Watson. I understand there was a night watchman on the premises when the fire occurred." "Yes, sir. Old Silas Trent. Been watching over this place near 20 years. Shaken to the bone, he is, but the inspector said as how you might want a word." The constable gestured toward a bench near the conservatory entrance, where an elderly man in a fraying coat sat hunched, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles were white. We crossed to him. His hair, what remained of it, stood in uneven wisps about his head, and his eyes held that dazed stare of one suddenly dislodged from the habits of a lifetime. Holmes seated himself beside him with the air of a man who has all the time in the world, though I knew every moment was already being weighed and sorted in that extraordinary mind. "Mr. Trent," Holmes said, his tone gentle but direct, "you have seen this place through many seasons. I should be obliged if you would tell us, as clearly as you are able, what transpired last night." The old man swallowed, his throat working visibly. "I've kept watch over these glass houses since before some of them gentlemen were born, sir," he began, his voice hoarse. "Never had so much as a broken pane out of the ordinary. Last night it were quiet as a grave. I made my rounds, like always. Lamps steady, plants all where they ought to be. Then it started." "The fire," I prompted when he faltered. "That's just it, sir." He shook his head, a tremor of genuine bewilderment passing over his features. There weren't no crackling, no roar like you'd get when wood catches. No smell of smoke at first. It were a sound, faint like. At first I thought it were the organ from the house down the road echoing low. A sort of humming it was, like voices a long way off, all singing the same note. It went straight through my bones. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "You are quite certain of this? No flames visible at the outset?" "No, sir. I went to the glass doors yonder to listen, and that's when I saw— well, it sounds daft, I know it does, but the light inside weren't right. It were as if the glass itself were glowing a pale sort of colour, not from a lamp or a lantern, but from the frames and panes together. Then all at once there came a sort of shiver through the whole place, a cracking like frost on a window. Next thing I knew, the panes burst, and the heat hit me like a blow. I fell back, and when I got to my feet, the whole house were burning." He raised shaking hands as though to ward off the memory. "I never heard a single scream, sir. Not one. If any poor soul were inside, they never called for help." Holmes remained very still, his hands loosely linked. "You have not heard the organ in that house for some weeks, have you, Mr. Trent? The musician is away." The old man blinked at him, startled, then nodded slowly as if Holmes had plucked the thought from his mind. "That is so, sir. I'd almost forgot it, but you're right. Then we may safely conclude that what you heard was not an earthly instrument. Fear not, I mean no supernatural implication. Nature has a sufficient store of mysteries without our inventing more." He rose. "You have been of great assistance. The constable will see that you are provided with whatever comfort the station can offer." As the old fellow was led away, and I turned to Holmes. "You attach importance to that description." "I attach importance to anything which stands at odds with expectation," he replied. "We have A conservatory in which glass appears to glow and shatter from within, fire that spreads unevenly, and an absence of human cries where we might reasonably anticipate them. Add to this these curious fragments. We return to the patterned shards upon the tiles. Holmes produced a small lens from his pocket and crouched once more. Observe, Watson, the edges of these pieces. They are thicker than ordinary pane glass and bear a slight opacity within their mass, as if some foreign substance were fused into them. And here, he indicated one particularly vivid sliver, you will note that faint violet hue. I bent closer. Indeed, a delicate coloration seemed to suffuse the interior of the shard, not as a surface stain, but as though it had grown there. When Holmes lifted it between finger and thumb, I caught the faintest trace of an unfamiliar scent, something neither floral nor mineral, yet suggesting at once the sharpness of salt and a cool, damp recess such as one might find beneath a river bank. Remarkable, I murmured. It carries the smell of the sea. Holmes bestowed upon me one of his rare approving glances. Just so, and yet we are far from any coast. The Thames, it is true, is not so distant, but I suspect our answers lie not upon the surface of that venerable waterway. You will have observed, too, the glove. Until he spoke, I had nearly forgotten the small, poignant object that lay half-pinned beneath a fallen trellis, its pale kid leather smudged with soot. I had seen many such articles in the aftermath of tragedy, each one a mute testament to the life that had once animated it. Holmes stooped and lifted it by the very edge, careful not to obscure the darkened imprint on the palm. "A lady's glove," I said. "Small hand. Refined origin, I should say." "Quite. And monogrammed 'It' in gold thread. We may presume, pending confirmation, that it belonged to Miss Evelyn Harrowgate, the botanical custodian attached to this property. Her absence since the fire is, I'm informed, of grave concern to her employers and of increasing interest to Scotland Yard." "Has any body been recovered?" I asked quietly. "None. And that, my dear Watson, is as curious as anything we have seen thus far." He straightened. "We shall, of course, allow for the possibility that the heat was sufficient to render such remains difficult to identify, but even the most voracious of fires leaves behind some mark of its passing upon flesh and bone. Here, so far as I can ascertain, we have only ruined plants, warped metal, and this inconvenient glove." He turned his keen gaze to the far end of the conservatory, where the blackened soil gave way to the marble of a narrow path leading toward a side gate. "Come," he said. "There is one more feature you must see before we pay our respects to the official mind." We followed the path. At first I saw nothing beyond the general disorder, but as we drew nearer, the pattern emerged. On the thin layer of ash that coated the marble, a sequence of footprints could be discerned, slight impressions left by a narrow boot, perhaps a woman's, moving from the interior toward the gate. Holmes indicated them with his cane. "You perceive them?" "Yes," I replied. "They suggest someone leaving the conservatory. The spacing is regular, the steps unhurried. The owner of the glove, perhaps?" "Possibly. Yet what interests me most is not that they lead outward, but where they cease." We traced them together. Step by step the impressions continued, growing fainter as the ash thinned, until at last they stopped altogether, some feet short of the gate. Beyond that point, the marble was untouched. "It is as if the person simply vanished," I said. Holmes inclined his head. "You have put it with your usual gift for directness. We must, of course, consider that the residue became too slight to register the foot, or that later disturbances have obscured the continuation. Still, the effect is suggestive, is it not? A path from flame into nothing." We stood in silence, contemplating that abrupt termination. Somewhere beyond the derelict glass, a cockerel crowed in the distance, heralding the day with an indifferent cry. To me, the whole scene possessed an unreality, as if we had stepped into the aftermath of some nightmare whose true horror was still concealed. Holmes was the first to move. He drew out his pocketbook, jotted a brisk note, and then folded it with precision. "This must go at once to Lestrade at Scotland Yard," he said. "If there have been any recent thefts or unusual occurrences pertaining to botanical specimens, particularly those of foreign origin, I should like to know of them before the morning is much older. There is an undercurrent here that bears, to my mind, the unmistakable taste of prior history." "A series of thefts," I repeated. "You think, then, that Miss Harrogate may have been involved in some clandestine trade?" "I think nothing of the sort," he replied, handing me the note. "I merely refrain from ruling out any avenue while the map is yet incomplete. You will oblige me, Watson, by seeing that this reaches the Yard with reasonable dispatch. Mention that it is from me. That will suffice." "I shall go at once," I said. He nodded, but his gaze had already returned to the violet-stained shard, which he now wrapped delicately in a scrap of paper and placed within his pocket. For an instant, as the pale light caught his features, I saw an expression there that I had seldom witnessed. Not triumph, nor even fierce curiosity, but a sober, almost reluctant recognition, as though some half-forgotten conjecture of his was stirring to life. "Take note, Watson," he said quietly, as I turned to go. "There are cases which reveal London to us in the harsh light of moral depravity, and there are those which illuminate its social injustices. This, I suspect, will show us something different, a region where knowledge itself treads dangerously close to the edge." His words lingered with me as I stepped out into the whitening morning, the ruins of the Conservatory at my back. I could not have said why, but as the cab bore me toward Scotland Yard, I had the distinct sensation that we stood not at the conclusion of some catastrophe, but at the outermost pane of a glass behind which stranger vistas waited, dim and inexplicable, for the touch that would bring them into view. I had scarcely delivered Holmes's note into the capable, if somewhat world-weary hands of Inspector Lestrade, when I found myself once more roused into action by a brisk knock upon the door of the small waiting room in which I had been instructed to sit. The Yard was quieter at that early hour, its corridors echoing faintly with the deliberate tread of clerks and constables beginning their day's labours. A grey light filtered through the high windows, lending even that bureaucratic hive a certain solemn dignity. Lestrade himself emerged, the note unfolded in his fingers, his expression a mixture of irritation and reluctant curiosity. "You'll forgive me, Doctor," he said, lowering his voice, "but I sometimes think your friend takes a certain pleasure in sending me questions that sound more like riddles than investigative requests." "I assure you," I replied, "Holmes takes pleasure only in facts, wherever they may hide." Yes, well, he's asked whether we have record of any removals, thefts, or disappearances related to botanical specimens. Not jewels, not banknotes, not firearms. Plants." The inspector scratched his chin. "I'll not pretend I see the sense in it, but I have seen stranger notions from him prove true." He walked me down the corridor and into a records room where an officer produced a ledger. Lestrade flipped through the entries with the mechanical precision of a man accustomed to cataloguing chaos. Most of these are petty matters. Pilfered lilies from private estates, orchids stolen from an exhibition near Marylebone, a few rare bulbs missing from Kew. Nothing that cries murder. Though, he stopped, frowning. Here is a curious one. A complaint filed anonymously, requesting that authorities monitor the removal of specimens from the Harrogate Conservatory, especially those acquired from maritime sources. I leaned in. Filed by whom? No name, no address, left at the gate in an unmarked envelope. Lestrade handed me the page. The writing, though slanted and impatient, bore an unmistakable elegance. Beside it, a blot of ink shaped like a wayward teardrop punctuated the final line. "Holmes will want to see this," I murmured. "I expect he already suspects half of it," Lestrade replied. "He has a habit of sending me notes only after he's 6 steps ahead." He closed the ledger and regarded me with that weary candor I had always appreciated in him. "Doctor, between us, is your friend on to something dangerous? When plants start burning houses down and citizens vanish without so much as a boot print, I cannot help but feel the city has problems I was not trained to confront." "There is danger," I said softly, "though whether it lies in crime or in knowledge, I cannot yet say." Lestrade sighed. "Then God help us either way." He allowed me to leave without further delay, and I made my way back through the restless morning streets toward Kensington, the wheels of the cab splashing through recent rain. The city, in its endless indifference, bustled around me, paper boys shouting headlines, ladies in feathered hats stepping carefully across crossings, a milk cart rattling over cobblestones. None of them would have suspected that their routine motions intersected so closely with mysteries that might, before long, concern them all. When I returned to the estate, Holmes was not in the ruins, but standing at the threshold of the house itself, speaking to a woman whose posture carried both refinement and exhaustion. Her gloved hands trembled slightly as she clutched a small embroidered reticule. Holmes waved me over. "Watson, allow me to present Mrs. Adelaide Harrowgate, sister-in-law to the missing botanist." She inclined her head, her eyes red-rimmed, though her manner remained composed. "Doctor, Mr. Holmes informs me you were present at the scene at first light." "I was. You have my deepest sympathies. Have there been any word of your relation?" "None," she replied. "Evelyn was devoted to her work, too much so, some said. My husband and I worried she spent more time among her specimens than among living company. Yet she was never irresponsible. She would not vanish without notice, nor leave the conservatory in such peril." Holmes's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. Had Miss Harrowgate been troubled in recent weeks? Any new acquaintances, unusual appointments, or professional disputes? Mrs. Harrowgate hesitated. She received letters, several in fact, thick envelopes stamped from distant ports. Scotland, I believe. I asked her about them once, but she grew pale and changed the subject. "Do you know where she kept these letters?" Holmes asked. "In her rooms at the back of the house. The servants have not touched them since last night. I can show you the way." We followed her through a narrow corridor lined with portraits, stern botanists with monocles, iron-jawed gentlemen in travelling coats, elderly scholars holding faded ferns like trophies. Evelyn's room was a modest chamber overlooking the garden, illuminated by a single tall window through which the light shone in a pale, watery beam. The room was immaculate, books arranged by size upon a shelf, a coat neatly folded upon a chair, not a single paper strewn carelessly. Yet it was the kind of order that invited scrutiny rather than trust, that silence of deliberate hands, too careful to leave their thoughts behind. Holmes crossed directly to the writing desk. Its surface was polished to a satin gleam, the inkwell sealed, the quill trimmed precisely. But tucked beneath the blotter was the faintest bulge of folded parchment. Holmes slid it free with the delicacy of a surgeon. Only half a sheet remained. The upper portion had been torn away jaggedly, leaving ragged fibers along the edge. The writing was unmistakably feminine, swift and slanted. I read over Holmes's shoulder. "The specimen responds only in moonless conditions. Its radiance is not inherent, but provoked by proximity to the..." The sentence ended abruptly. Beneath it, a single phrase stood alone, scrawled with haste rather than elegance. "Borrowed light." I gasped softly, for those last words echoed the torn page we had received in Baker Street. Holmes folded the fragment and slipped it into his inner pocket. "Mrs. Harrowgate," he said, "I must ask whether your sister-in-law ever spoke of maritime expeditions, ships perhaps that supplied her work?" Her eyes widened, not with confusion but dread. "She did. She mentioned a voyage years ago, a vessel called the Iridescent. She said its gardens were not planted by man, but found already thriving upon the deck, as though the ship itself had carried them from the deep. Forgive me, Doctor. but sometimes her words frightened me. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Do you know where she might have gone in the days before the fire?" Mrs. Harrogate pressed a handkerchief to her lips. She often left in the evenings. She returned with her boots wet and her coat smelling of brine, yet she never told me where she had been. I feared she consorted with disreputable seamen. Now, her voice broke, now I fear something far worse. Holmes placed a steadying hand upon her chair. "We shall do all we can to find her. For now, I urge you not to speak of these details to anyone beyond this room. There are forces at play here that thrive upon secrecy." As we left the chamber, Holmes walked with uncharacteristic silence until we reached the conservatory once more. There he paused, gazing not at the ruins, but at the pale sky above them. "Well, Watson," he said quietly, "we have confirmation that Miss Harrogate's work extended beyond horticulture. The question now is whether she pursued her discoveries or fled from them." "And what do you believe?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the fragment in his pocket. "I believe," he said at last, "that the line between natural science and the unknown is drawn not by the universe, but by the limits of our courage." He turned sharply. "Come. There is another thread we must follow, the docks. And what shall we seek there? Whoever fled upon seeing us at Miss Harrogate's door, he was no idle passer-by. He bore the look of a man who recognized the name Holmes and regretted it." With that, he set off at a pace that left me scarcely time to fasten my coat, and once again London unfolded before us, its familiar streets whispering secrets that would not remain buried long. The wind at the docks carried with it that unmistakable mixture of tar, brine, and coal smoke, a scent that seemed to seep into one's garments and remain there long after leaving the water's edge. Ships drifted in and out of their moorings like great slumbering beasts, their masts swaying with the languid confidence of creatures accustomed to both storm and stillness. It was here, among swaying lanterns and the scrape of ropes upon wet wood, that Holmes believed the next thread of our mystery awaited us. I could not deny the logic. More than once had London's darkest enigmas found their origin in the restless tides. Holmes walked ahead with sharp purpose, the hem of his coat whipping softly behind him. He paused only to glance at faces. Dock workers, sailors unloading crates, a group of men in heavy coats whispering in Gaelic near a stack of salted barrels. His eyes passed over each figure not with idle attention, but as though reading a living ledger, ticking through possibilities with swift elimination. I followed close, though I confess the early hour combined with the long journey from Kensington left my body craving rest. Yet Holmes's urgency was contagious. One could no more leisurely stroll behind him than one could nap through a thunderstorm. At last, we halted near a weather-worn tavern that leaned so precariously toward the water that its reflection in the black surface below appeared more upright than its structure above. A dim lantern swung above the doorway, its glass cracked and patched with soot. The name upon the hanging board had nearly faded, the widow's oath. "This establishment," Holmes murmured without turning, "has changed ownership 3 times in 4 years. Its clientele has not. The man who fled her lodgings last night is likely to reappear here. If not today, then soon. How can you be sure he was no ordinary passer-by? An ordinary passer-by avoids eye contact when he flees. That man looked directly into my face before running. Fear of recognition, not fear of presence. Therefore, he knows either me or the case. It is unlikely he recognizes me by reputation alone, for he did not pause to challenge or observe. He fled instantly. Thus, he knows Miss Harrogate personally or is involved in events she has touched." He stepped into the tavern. I followed. The interior was no brighter than the exterior suggested. A sour mixture of spilled ale and ancient timber clung to the air like sediment. A half-dozen sailors occupied the room, their shoulders hunched over tankards, faces gaunt from long voyages. A woman with a scar running from ear to collarbone polished glasses behind the counter. Holmes did not sit, but surveyed the room with a stillness that belied the quickness of his thoughts. It was he, not I, who first noticed the sailor in the corner, lean, pale, a long coat buttoned high about his throat, though the air was not cold enough to warrant such protection. He seemed, unlike the others, to be drinking not for warmth or pleasure, but as though the act itself were a shield. His hands trembled faintly around the cup. His eyes flicked toward us only once, and in that brief instant I glimpsed something I could not immediately name. Fear, yes, but tinged with a sorrow so deep it bordered on despair. Holmes approached him as though the idea had only just occurred. "A fair morning for long journeys," he remarked conversationally. The man stiffened. "Depends where one's journey ends." "Let us hope," Holmes replied, lowering himself into the opposite seat without invitation. "It ends on land rather than beneath it." At that, the man set his cup down too quickly. Liquid sloshed over his fingers, yet he did not flinch. "You're Holmes," he whispered. "I knew you'd come." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Then let us spare time with preliminaries. You fled Miss Harrowgate's residence last night. Tell me why." The man swallowed so visibly it seemed to echo in the dim room. "I wasn't there to harm her, I swear it. I only went to see if she'd returned." "Returned from where?" His gaze fell to the table. "The sea." The tavern suddenly felt colder. Holmes remained silent, forcing the man to continue. "She promised she'd stop, that she wouldn't go back to them. Said the specimens were never meant for land. Said the others, those society men, were meddling with forces they didn't understand." "And what did you understand?" Holmes asked softly. The sailor's face twisted in misery. "I was on the iridescent. I was one of the hands." The name struck me like a physical blow. Holmes did not move, but his eyes gleamed. "We never meant to bring them ashore," the sailor continued, voice shaking. "We only meant to transport them, but the captain, he changed course. Said there'd be glory in discovery. Riches, institutions lining up to study what we'd found. Only we didn't find them." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "They found you." The man closed his eyes. "Aye." A silence fell so heavy it seemed to press upon the walls. "What happened to your crew?" I asked quietly. He opened his eyes, haunted. "We anchored near a cove north of the Hebrides. Waters glowed beneath us like lantern oil, but it weren't reflection. The light came from below. And then we heard it, that low note, like a choir singing through water. It rattled the hull, the plants on deck. They woke. They opened like mouths. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. How many survived? 6. All of us changed." He looked down at his bare hands as though expecting them to betray him. Holmes observed him with a level, almost merciful calm. "Then tell me why Miss Harrowgate returned to the cove." "To send them back," the sailor whispered. "She said we were thieves, that they were never meant to bloom under our skies. She said borrowed light draws borrowed blood." He looked up at Holmes suddenly. "But they won't let her. The society, they want to grow them, cultivate them, weaponize the glow. She begged me to stay out of it, said I'd drown if I followed. But I can't leave her to them. Not after what we saw." Before Holmes could reply, the tavern door slammed open. A group of men in polished coats entered, their boots too clean for sailors. One wore a pinned silver insignia shaped like a stylized petal. The sailor's face drained of color. Holmes stood with slow precision. "Watson, take the far exit. We must not be drawn into confrontation here. The man must be kept alive." The men advanced. Their leader removed his gloves with cold deliberation. "Gentlemen," he said, "I believe you are interfering in matters that do not concern the public sphere." Holmes stepped between them and the sailor. "On the contrary," he replied, "anything that threatens London concerns her public." What happened next occurred with shocking swiftness. One of the intruders overturned the nearest lantern. Glass shattered, oil spilled. The flame leapt hungrily to the tavern floor. The room erupted in shouts. Chairs overturned. Smoke rose in terrifying ribbons. Holmes seized the sailor's arm. Through the back. We pushed through a narrow passage, smoke clawing at our throats. Bursting into the chill air behind the tavern, we stumbled onto the dockside once more, the sailor gasping violently for breath. Holmes steadied him. "You will meet us again at Baker Street," he ordered, "before nightfall." The sailor nodded once, trembling. Then he fled into the labyrinth of moored ships and vanished. Holmes watched the direction long after he disappeared. Only then did he speak. "Watson," he said quietly, "we are dealing not with the aftermath of a crime, but with the collision of two wills, one seeking suppression, the other preservation. The danger is no longer hypothetical." I exhaled, still tasting smoke. "And Miss Harrogate stands between them." Holmes turned toward the Thames, its surface dark and inscrutable. "London stands between them." We walked in silence as the first hints of sunlight caught the river's edge, turning the black water into a tarnished mirror. Whatever lay beneath those depths, it waited patiently. We left the docks, still carrying with us the acrid stain of smoke from the tavern, though the flames had been quickly subdued by those within. Holmes walked with long, unbroken strides, his gaze fixed ahead, though his thoughts were clearly cast far across the city, knitting together fragments of evidence with that invisible thread his mind alone could perceive. I'd grown accustomed to such silences, yet there was something different in this one. Something taut, as though he feared that, speaking too soon, might disturb a delicate balance. Only when we reached the broader thoroughfare, and the river lay half hidden behind warehouses and stone embankments, did he halt. "We learned more than we lost in that encounter," he said at last. The sailor confirmed a maritime connection, tied the ship to specimens of unknown origin, and named Miss Harrogate's purpose. More significantly, the society was willing to act with open violence to prevent his speech. They would not risk such exposure unless the truth endangered them profoundly. "You believe they set the tavern ablaze?" Holmes's lips curved into a humorless half-smile. "A man does not drop a lantern with such precision by clumsiness. It was an attempt not to kill us, though they may have welcomed that outcome, but to sever the conversation. They needed secrecy more than blood." We flagged a passing hansom and took seats inside. As the horse jolted forward, the wheels rattling over slick cobblestone, Holmes withdrew the fragment of Miss Harrogate's torn note and regarded it under the weak daylight. "Borrowed light," he repeated. "A curious phrase. It suggests a phenomenon dependent upon external illumination, perhaps an energy drawn rather than emitted. If these organisms bloom only under specific conditions, their transportation to the conservatory was no simple matter." I noted the faint weariness beneath his eyes, though his voice retained its cutting sharpness. "Holmes, if these plants, or whatever they are, hold such potential danger, are we wise to pursue this alone? Should we not appeal to the authorities in full?" "My dear Watson, authority is no shield against ignorance. If we entrusted this investigation to official hands now, we should find half of London wearing medals while the other half sickened in hospitals. Until we understand what we face, discretion is our only ally." The cab drew to a stop near Westminster Bridge. The sky, pale and swollen with moisture, cast the river beneath into a muted steel. Holmes dismissed the cab, then guided me down to the lower steps of the embankment, where the Thames lapped against stone with a restrained, rhythmic insistence. A fisherman stood nearby with his line cast into the murky water, his hat pulled low, his expression one of quiet endurance. Holmes approached him without hesitation. "Good morning. I understand you have, in recent weeks, caught more than fish in these waters." The fisherman turned slightly, his weather-grooved face reflecting neither surprise nor fear. He studied Holmes with the slow discernment of a man who had seen more peculiarities in life than he would ever speak of. Depends what you're looking for. Something pale, unfamiliar, a bloom that withers in air. The man exhaled softly, as though releasing a weight he had carried in silence. You speak of the ghost lily. Found one tangled in mealine before sunrise 3 weeks past. Soft as sea foam. Near gave me a fright, it did. Took it home in a bucket of river water. By the time the kettle boiled, it were nothing but ash. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. And you told no one? He shook his head. Who'd listen? Folk already say the river's cursed. No need to feed the stories. Where did you catch it precisely? Holmes pressed. The fisherman gestured downstream. Tween those arches at Blackfriars Reach, near the old boathouses. Tide pulls strange there. Things rise that ought to stay sunk. Holmes thanked him and placed a coin in his palm, though the man attempted to refuse. Then we continued along the embankment, our boots echoing lightly on wet stone. So the river was a conduit, I said. The specimens were transported by water rather than land. Or returned to it, Holmes replied. Consider the footprints near the conservatory, ending abruptly, not fading gradually. If the bearer stepped into a boat, the trail would vanish. The footprints led outward, not inward. Someone departed after the blaze began. And you believe that someone was Miss Harrogate? He paused before answering. If she survived, she may have fled rather than perished. The glove may have been torn away in distress, or dropped deliberately. I'm inclined to suspect she was taken or pursued. Voluntary departure would not require concealment of her footsteps beyond the gate. We soon reached the very arches the fisherman had described. Underneath the sweeping bridge, the tide murmured with a sound like low, hissing breath. Wooden boathouses slumped against the stone, their roofs sagging, doors chained or rotted. Holmes led me toward one structure whose hinges bore scorch marks, not from flame, but from some chemical corrosion. The wood appeared bleached rather than burned. This, he murmured, crouching to inspect the damage, was cut, not melted, not torn. A chemical reaction, likely from contact with the same residue upon the conservatory frame. The society used these places to move specimens quietly. The crates we saw last night did not begin their journey there. They ended it. And the men we saw consigning them to the water. Holmes stood, eyes darkened. Destruction of evidence, or reintegration with their origin. Whatever these organisms are, they are linked to the depths. The society now seeks to erase its involvement. A faint sound interrupted him. An oar striking wood, followed by hushed voices carried faintly across water. Holmes motioned for silence, drawing me behind a granite buttress. From our vantage, we saw a narrow skiff slide across the still water, manned by 3 figures cloaked in heavy garments. They bore no lamps, yet the water beneath them shimmered faintly, as though answering their passage. One man lifted a covered jar, its contents pulsing faintly like embers trapped beneath glass. A second man whispered urgently, "Keep it sealed. Borrowed light draws. Watchers." My breath caught. Holmes leaned so close I felt his coat brush mine. A third voice replied, "We return these to the tide tonight. London must forget. If the woman speaks again, she will undo all we've buried." "Miss Harrogate," I whispered. Holmes did not move, but his jaw tightened. The skiff drifted under the arch and into shadow, the faint glow beneath it fading like a dying star. When they vanished, Holmes straightened and released a long, controlled breath. "We are no longer tracing evidence," he said quietly. "We are witnessing the cover of an event already in motion." "And what now?" Holmes turned from the river, his coat dark against the pale sky. "Now we go to Baker Street. There are analyses to conduct, samples to examine, and telegrams to send. And we must prepare, Watson, for the possibility that Miss Harrogate is alive, and that those who hunt her will reach her before we do." We ascended the embankment steps once more, leaving the river to its murmured secrets. Yet as we walked, I could not shake the feeling that the water watched us in return, its depths holding memories not meant for human recall, waiting only for the next moonless night to rise again. The journey back to Baker Street was taken in relative silence, though the city had fully awakened by the time we reached its familiar thoroughfares. Carriages rattled past in steady procession. Vendors called out the day's offerings, and the clatter of hoofbeats mingled with the shrill whistle of a distant train. Ordinary sounds that felt strangely dissonant after the eerie quiet beneath Blackfriars Reach. It is one of London's peculiarities that the grasp of the commonplace reasserts itself, even while one stands in the shadow of the inexplicable. Yet Holmes walked as though the streets were merely corridors of his own mind, his steps rapid and purposeful. Once inside our rooms, Holmes removed his coat with impatient motion and strode directly to his work table, scattering instruments and papers with a gesture. "We have precious little time, Watson," he said, "and the city's tranquility is but a veil stretched thin." He retrieved the violet-hued shard from his pocket and placed it beneath the glass of his microscope. I saw from his expression that his earlier suspicions were only further confirmed. "There is no silicate structure," he murmured. "The lattice is organic, fibrous rather than crystalline." He motioned for me to observe. Through the instrument I beheld a pattern unlike any natural material I had studied, even during my medical years. Thread-like filaments intertwined like the veins of a leaf, yet possessing a faint luminescence along their edges, as though retaining memory of the strange glow witnessed at the conservatory. "This is not glass at all," I said softly. "No," Holmes replied, "but some biological substance hardened under extreme conditions. One might call it glass only in the poetic sense, not the scientific. The pattern resembles coral more than quartz." "And the scent of salt water," I added, recalling the faint brine that had lingered like a ghost upon my senses. Holmes paced the length of the room, hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. "Consider the implications, Watson. These specimens, if we may call them that, were neither cultivated from seeds nor engineered through artifice. They are fragments of something whole. Their presence in a conservatory suggests containment rather than display. Miss Harrogate may have attempted to preserve them, perhaps even return them to their origin." "You speak as though the specimens were alive," I said. He paused. "Not alive in the conventional sense, but responsive, adaptable. That which reacts to environment exhibits behavior, and behavior implies motive, however primitive." The thought unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Plants, even the most exotic, do not choose to destroy conservatories or lure seamen to distant shores. Yet the sailors' haunted eyes lingered in my mind, as did the memory of those crates sinking silently into the Thames. Holmes returned to his table, carefully scraping the shard to collect a trace of residue. He introduced the sample into a small glass phial, then combined it with drops of distilled water. The reaction was immediate. The liquid clouded, then emitted a faint shimmering sheen, as though the water itself had been stirred by moonlight. Holmes leaned close. "Observe the reaction. The substance is dormant in air, but responsive to moisture. These organisms, if organisms they are, may require aquatic conditions to retain form." "In other words," I said, "they die on land." He looked at me sharply. "Not die, Watson. Transform. The ash we saw may not be death at all, but metamorphosis." I felt a chill sweep through me. Then perhaps Miss Harrogate's purpose was not cultivation, but prevention. If the specimens adapt when removed from water, that adaptation might be uncontrollable, he finished. "Precisely." A sudden knock at the door interrupted our work. Mrs. Hudson entered, her brow furrowed. "A gentleman here to see you, Mr. Holmes. He refuses to give his name, and he says it is a matter of urgency." Holmes exchanged a brief look with me. "Show him in," The gentleman who stepped through the door was tall, impeccably dressed, with grey streaks at his temples and a gaze sharp enough to cut glass. His cane bore a silver ornament shaped like a blooming flower, the same stylized petal insignia worn by the men at the tavern. Holmes spoke first. "The Royal Horticultural Society sends an emissary, I presume." The man removed his hat with stiff civility. "Not the society. I speak only for myself. My name is Percival Durrell." His voice held the measured cadence of a man accustomed to authority. "You have interfered in matters that extend far, beyond a simple fire. Miss Harrogate is under our protection. I advise you to cease your inquiries." Holmes regarded him with cool indifference. "Protection? I witnessed your men attempting to destroy evidence and silence witnesses." Durrell's jaw tightened. "A regrettable necessity. London must not be exposed to forces it is ill-prepared to understand." "And you are prepared?" Holmes asked. Durrell's gaze hardened. "We are more suited to steward these discoveries than a lone botanist driven by guilt." Holmes stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Where is Miss Harrogate?" A flicker, whether of anger, fear, or calculation, passed across Durrell's features. "Alive," he said at last, "and safer without your involvement. You pursue truth for its own sake, Mr. Holmes. Others pursue it to avert disaster." Holmes's tone chilled. "There is a difference between stewardship and possession." Durrell turned toward the door. "And there is a difference between wisdom and arrogance. I shall warn you once more. Let the matter rest. Some knowledge is not for public consumption." Holmes did not step aside. Durrell lowered his voice. "If you continue, you may force our hand. Not all who vanished from the iridescent remained lost." There was something in the way he spoke the ship's name, something that left the room colder than before. Without another word, he departed. Holmes remained motionless for a long moment. Then he spoke softly, almost to himself. "They do not fear exposure of Miss Harrogate's actions. They fear exposure of their own." "And what shall we do?" I asked. Holmes turned to me with resolve burning in his eyes. "We find Miss Harrogate before they do, and we begin where their grip is weakest, those who are on that ship." He moved swiftly to the mantel and retrieved his coat. "Watson, we return to the river tonight. Between the tides, beneath the arches of Blackfriars. The truth lingers, and there are those who watch who may be persuaded to speak." I swallowed, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. "And if the society follows us?" Holmes allowed the faintest, most dangerous smile. "Then we shall see how well they swim." Night had not yet fallen, but the day had taken on the hue of stormlight, heavy and expectant. The river, restless and dark, waited like a throat swallowing secrets, and we would descend into it once more. Dusk crept over London like a curtain of diluted ink, softening the harsher outlines of buildings and lending the river a brooding sense of anticipation. I've always believed that the Thames possesses a double life. By day a conduit of commerce, by night a restless artery carrying old secrets beneath her surface. As Holmes and I made our way once more toward Blackfriars Reach, that sensation pressed upon me with uncanny force. The lamps along the embankment glowed faintly through gathering mist, their reflections trembling in water that looked more like polished obsidian than a flowing current. Holmes walked in silence, though his stride carried none of the contemplative gentleness of our earlier return from Kensington. He moved with the tense precision of a man approaching a battlefield. Even his gloved hands remained clasped behind his back with an almost martial rigidity. Only when we reached the downward steps leading to the water's edge did he speak. "You recall the sailor's words," he said, his voice low. "They bloom only under borrowed light. I suspect that tonight we may witness the phenomenon ourselves. Moonless, tide-turning, the river drawing inward rather than outward." "Holmes," I said softly, "you speak as though the river itself participates in these events." He paused, then turned his sharp profile toward me. It is not the river that acts, Watson, but that which lies beneath it. Let us not fall into the trap of anthropomorphizing the unknown. Yet there was something in his tone that suggested even he was not entirely immune to the feeling that we were trespassers on a threshold between worlds. We descended to the lower quay, where the stone arches overhead framed darkness like a series of portals. The tide had retreated just enough to reveal slick patches of algae and barnacle-covered pilings that glistened like bones in lamplight. Far off, a barge creaked, though no crewmen called out to us. London, vast and indifferent, had withdrawn into its own nocturnal hush. Holmes withdrew a small lantern of polished brass, though he did not yet light it. "Light draws attention," he murmured. "For now, our eyes must adjust." We waited. It was a peculiar kind of waiting, neither idle nor restful, the kind that hems one's thoughts into silence. A fog rolled along the water, not thick enough to obscure our surroundings, but low and crawling, as though hugging the river's surface. The air carried a faint metallic scent, not rust, not salt, but something sharper, tinged with the memory of storms. Then, without warning, we heard it. A hum, soft, resonant, so low I felt it more in my bones than my ears. It swelled gradually, not like music rising in triumph, but like a note held too long, vibrating with dangerous patience. Holmes stiffened beside me. "That is the sound described by the night watchman," I whispered. Holmes raised his finger for silence. The hum shifted in pitch, splintering into faint harmonics that moved beneath the arches like unseen currents. The water stirred, not from wind or passing ships, but from below. A faint radiance emerged from the depths, no brighter than the glow of decaying wood at first, but growing more distinct, resolving into patterns. Shapes, not shapes of fish or weed, but filaments, pale as frost, unfurling in slow spirals beneath the surface. They pulsed faintly, as though answering the unseen note, and the water around them shimmered with the same hue we had observed upon the glass shard. Holmes breathed a single word. "There." We knelt near the edge, careful not to disturb the surface. The filaments twisted upward, not quite breaking through the water, but rising like tendrils, seeking air they could not survive. One strand brushed against the stone embankment and instantly desiccated into fine ash, dissolving into the breeze. The rest recoiled, sinking again into shadow. Holmes spoke just above a whisper. They reacted versely to exposure, yet continued to seek it. A contradictory instinct. One might call it a struggle. To survive, or to return. There was movement behind us. Footsteps, soft, cautious, approaching through the fog. Holmes rose without haste, as though expecting them. I followed suit, adrenaline quickening my pulse. The figure that emerged was slight and unsteady, wrapped in a cloak far too large for her narrow frame. Her hair hung damp against her face. She clutched the railing for balance before lifting her eyes to us. "Miss Harrogate," Holmes said calmly, though I saw his surprise flicker beneath the composure. She was pale, paler than any invalid I had tended in the army hospitals, yet her gaze held fierce resolve. She approached, swaying slightly as though her limbs remembered some rhythm the land did not share. "You should not be here," she said, voice strained. "Neither of you. They will come." Holmes stepped toward her, slow and deliberate. "We have searched for you with earnest purpose. You are believed dead, abducted, or complicit. Help us determine which." A faint, wistful smile touched her lips. "Complicit? No. A witness, perhaps. A survivor, regrettably." She looked to the water. "And a trespasser." "Upon what?" Holmes asked. Her eyes glimmered with something beyond sorrow, fear layered with reverence, upon a realm that does not belong to us. The specimens aboard the iridescent were not cargo. They were passengers. I felt my breath catch. Holmes remained still. "If passengers, then your society has committed an act beyond theft." They were warned. she whispered. We all were. But men do not heed warnings when gold and glory beckon. They sought to harness the light, to force it to bloom for our benefit. And when the specimens resisted, they believed destruction the only path to containment. She clutched at her throat as though the memory suffocated her. The fire was not intended. I tried to move them before the society arrived. I misjudged the reaction when dry air touched their roots. The conservatory was never meant to be their home. It was a sanctuary, temporary and fragile. They panicked. They tried to return to water. I exchanged a horrified glance with Holmes. You are speaking of plants as though they possessed intent. She turned to me with sudden intensity. Not intent, Doctor. Memory. Before Holmes could question her further, the hum intensified once more, no longer distant but encroaching. The water churned. From the far arch, a lantern appeared, followed by the silhouettes of boatmen propelling themselves rapidly toward our position. Their coats bore the same petal insignia. The society had come. Miss Harrogate staggered backward. Holmes reached for her arm, but she shook her head violently. "Do not let them take me," she gasped. "They will silence everything. They must not learn what I have learned. Promise me. Promise." Her plea was drowned by a pistol shot that shattered the night air. The bullet struck stone mere inches from Holmes's feet, sending chips scattering. Holmes seized my shoulder. "We must retreat. Now." Miss Harrogate lurched toward the river as though drawn by it. For a moment I feared she would throw herself into the depths, but instead she paused just at the edge, staring down with trembling resolve. "I cannot go with them," she whispered. "I belong to neither world now." Holmes stepped forward, urgency breaking through his reserve. "Miss Harrogate, whatever you have seen, you need not face its burden alone." But she shook her head with a look that cut me to the core. Some truths cannot be shared without consequence. The society's skiff struck the quay. Boots thundered upon wet stone. We were seconds from confrontation. Miss Harrogate met Holmes's gaze one final time, and in that instant I saw a silent exchange, part gratitude, part plea for forgiveness. Then she plunged into the Thames. The water swallowed her without a cry. Holmes lunged forward, but the river had already closed around her, the glow beneath its surface blooming once more like distant lightning, illuminating her form for the briefest moment before darkness reclaimed it. The society men shouted orders, but Holmes did not hear them. He stood frozen, staring into the depths, the lantern light painting stark hollows beneath his eyes. "Holmes," I whispered, "we must go." He did not move until the glow beneath the river finally faded. When he turned from the water, his expression held not defeat, but something rarer, an emotion I had seen only a handful of times in all the years of our companionship. A sense of responsibility. "Watson," he said quietly, "London stands at the edge of a precipice, and now the only person who understood its depths has been reclaimed by them." We disappeared into the fog before the society could close upon us. The night swallowed our escape as completely as the river had swallowed her. By the time we regained the relative safety of Baker Street, the image of Miss Harrogate vanishing beneath the black surface of the Thames had imprinted itself upon my mind with such vividness that it eclipsed even the most harrowing scenes from my military years. I have seen men fall in battle, torn down by bullets and shrapnel, yet there was something uniquely dreadful in the quiet finality of that plunge. No cry, no struggle, only a surrender to depths that pulsed with unearthly light. Holmes did not speak during the journey. When we stepped into our familiar sitting room, he removed his coat as though it weighed twice its usual amount, then went directly to the mantelpiece, where he stood with both hands pressed upon it, his head bowed. For a long while, I remained silent. There are moments when speech is not merely useless, but profane. The city outside carried on with its usual din, carriages rolling past, vendors calling, distant laughter rising from some convivial gathering. Yet within our rooms there existed a stillness so complete that even the ticking of the clock seemed intrusive. The fire had burned low, casting a subdued glow upon Holmes's austere profile. At last he spoke, his voice subdued. "You will be wondering, Watson, whether we have failed her." I started, for he had given expression to the exact thought that haunted me. "We could not have reached her in time," I said. "The Society's men were upon us. Had we delayed further—" He cut me off with a slight motion of his hand. "I am not speaking of that final moment. I refer to the days preceding it. Miss Harrogate sought to undo harm that was not wholly of her own making, yet she did so alone. She viewed us, I suspect, as potential obstacles rather than allies, and it is I who must bear responsibility for that perception. My reputation is such that those who keep secrets fear me more than those who intend wickedness." "Holmes," I protested, "you cannot condemn yourself for the warped interpretations of others. She was a woman under extraordinary strain, divided between her conscience and forces beyond her control. We arrived too late to earn her trust." He remained motionless. "Perhaps, yet the result is the same. She has gone, and with her, knowledge no other soul possesses in full." He straightened abruptly, as though the very act of introspection offended his nature. "Self-reproach is a luxury we cannot afford. We must attend to those fragments of understanding that remain within our reach." He crossed to his work table and began, with renewed fervor, to arrange the instruments he had used earlier that day. The vial of shimmering residue still stood upon the tray, its surface dulled now that the water had been sitting for some hours. Holmes held it to the lamplight and frowned. "Observe how the luminescence fades," he said. "Yet it does not vanish completely. It lingers, as though reluctant to depart, much like our late botanist's conscience." He took a fresh sample from the violet shard, then diluted it with a new measure of distilled water. Once more the strange sheen emerged, faint but undeniable, spreading through the liquid like ink and paper before subsiding into a quiet glow. "You see, Watson," he continued, "the reaction is repeatable. Whatever force animates this substance is not exhausted by single exposure. It responds to contact, adapts, then settles into a new equilibrium. Now consider Miss Harrogate's words: borrowing light, not producing, not radiating, but borrowing." "From the environment," I ventured. "Perhaps from any source of energy it can access," he replied. "Lamps, moonlight, even the human nervous system. Remember the sailors' account of the note they heard aboard the iridescent, a sound that shook bones and rattled the hull. Sound is but vibration. If these organisms respond to vibration, they may treat it as we treat air, something to be drawn in and transformed." "You suggest they feed upon it?" I asked. "I suggest they repurpose it," he said. "Transformation rather than consumption. The glow we see may be the byproduct of that exchange." I shuddered. And if such a force were harnessed by men like Durrell? Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. "Imagine lamps that never dim, weapons that blind without flame, instruments powered not by coal, but by manipulated vibration. The temptation for those who worship progress above ethics would be irresistible." A silence fell between us. The fire crackled softly, its ordinary warmth suddenly reassuring against the strange possibilities of which we spoke. At length I asked, "Do you believe Miss Harrogate is truly gone?" Holmes paused, his hand resting upon the microscope. "The Thames is a voracious custodian, Watson. Few who surrender themselves to it return with breath, yet I cannot ignore the peculiar manner of her disappearance. There was no struggle, no panic, only decision." His eyes darkened. "You saw the glow beneath her as she sank?" "Yes," I admitted. It seemed almost to welcome her. "Precisely," he said. "If these organisms respond to proximity, if they seek to integrate any foreign element that enters their domain, then it is possible that in her final moments she entered a state we can neither define nor measure. To the coroner, she will be a missing body. To the river, she may be something else. The notion disturbed me more profoundly than if he had declared her simply dead. You are not suggesting resurrection or any such fantastical notion? His voice remained firm. No, Watson, only transformation. What becomes of the mind when the body is altered beyond recognition, I leave to philosophers. My concern is with what remains in this room. He turned to the mantel, where a folded scrap of paper lay undisturbed since the morning. It was the torn fragment from the anonymous complaint at Scotland Yard, the one urging authorities to monitor specimens with maritime origin. Holmes smoothed it upon the table. "Consider this," he said. "Someone recognized the danger before the conservatory burned. Someone not affiliated with the society, else they would hardly have risked official attention. The handwriting bears certain flourishes, akin to Miss Harrowgate's, but not identical. A close relation, perhaps, or a colleague." "A survivor of the iridescent," I suggested. "Precisely what I am beginning to suspect," he replied. "The sailor we met today confessed openly to his role. The others have remained silent, yet men who have seen what he has seen do not simply resume ordinary life. They leave traces, unaccountable absences, resignations, voyages cut short, hospital admissions for maladies physicians cannot diagnose." He moved to his desk and drew out a map of London, pinning it to the wall with quick, precise gestures. Upon it, he marked several points: the Conservatory in Kensington, the location of the widow's oath, the arches at Blackfriars Reach, and a fourth point near the river docks of Limehouse. "What lies at Limehouse?" I asked. "A clinic," Holmes replied. "A private establishment catering to seamen and dock workers, noted in certain circles for its discreet treatment of unusual afflictions. Lestrade once mentioned it in relation to a case involving hallucinations aboard a cargo vessel. I dismissed it then as probable opium poisoning. Now I am less certain." He took up his hat once more. "We go there, Watson." "Tonight." I blinked. "Tonight? After all we have endured by the river? Surely we may allow ourselves a few hours' rest." He looked at me with a mixture of apology and resolve. "You may, if you wish. I will not think less of you, but events are moving swiftly. The society grows bolder. Miss Harrowgate is lost. Durrell has warned us explicitly. Every moment of delay is a concession to those who would bury this affair in darkness and in water." My fatigue warred with my loyalty for a brief instant, but the latter has always held the stronger position where Holmes is concerned. I rose and reached for my own coat. "You will not go alone," I said simply. A fleeting warmth touched his eyes. "I knew I might rely upon you." The journey to Limehouse took us through narrower streets and denser fog than those we had traversed earlier. The lamps here were fewer, their glass panes dirtied by soot and neglect. The river's odor grew sharper, mingling with the smells of spices, coal smoke, and the faint tang of opium that clung to certain alleyways. At last, we arrived before a modest brick building whose brass plaque bore only the name of a physician and no hint of its more unusual clientele. Holmes knocked. After a brief interval, a narrow-eyed man in a worn frock coat opened the door. He studied us with professional wariness. "Yes? We take no new patients without appointment." Holmes inclined his head. "We are not patients, sir, but we seek knowledge, and I believe you possess more of it than you are comfortable admitting. We wish to speak about survivors of a particular vessel." The man's expression did not change, but his fingers tightened upon the doorframe. "I treat many sailors. I do not discuss their cases with strangers." Holmes's voice softened. "This concerns phenomena that your own training may not fully explain. I ask only for conversation, not confession. The ship's name is the Iridescent." A flicker passed through the man's eyes, as rapid and unmistakable as lightning behind clouds. For a moment, I thought he would slam the door. Instead, he opened it a fraction wider. "You had better come in, then," he said quietly. "For if you have spoken that name aloud in this city, I fear you may already be in more danger than you realize." The passage into the Limehouse Clinic felt less like entering a place of healing than stepping into a confessional chapel for the wounded and the damned. The air inside carried the lingering odor of carbolic, camphor, and tobacco, undercut by subtler notes of sea damp ingrained into the clothing of countless mariners. Lamps burned low in glass shades, their light softened to a muted glow that cast long shadows along the corridor. I could hear, from behind closed doors, the muffled groans of patients and the occasional clink of glass against metal. Our host led us to a small consulting room at the rear of the building. Its walls were lined with shelves, crowded with medical texts, apothecary jars, and a few worn anatomical diagrams curling at the edges. A narrow examination couch occupied one corner, its sheet freshly laundered but bearing the faint indentations of recent use. The man shut the door and turned to face us, his features sharpened by the lamplight. "My name is Dr. Elias Morcant," he said. "I treat those whom other physicians dismiss as malingerers or lunatics. Your mention of that ship tells me you are either mad yourselves or have seen enough to understand that madness is sometimes the rational reaction to impossible things." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "We have seen enough to know that the iridescent did not merely vanish in a storm. Survivors walk London streets, though they seem more haunted than spared. One, at least, frequents a tavern called the Widow's Oath. Another, I strongly suspect, has been writing anonymous warnings to Scotland Yard. You have treated them, Doctor?" Dr. Morcant regarded Holmes with a level gaze. "And if I have?" "Then you have seen afflictions that defy conventional diagnosis," Holmes replied. "Symptoms that cannot be explained by laudanum, fever, or head injury. I ask you to describe them." Morcant hesitated. His hand drifted unconsciously toward a decanter on the side table, but he drew it back before touching it. "I do not betray my patients lightly, Mr. Holmes." "You will not betray them," Holmes said calmly. "You will honor them by helping us prevent what befell them from befalling others." The physician's shoulders sagged by a fraction, as though some internal struggle had resolved itself without victory. He motioned for us to sit, then drew a chair opposite and steepled his fingers. "The first came to me 3 years ago," he began, "a deckhand from the iridescent, though he did not say so at first. He complained of hearing a sound no one else could hear, a low note that vibrated in his bones. At night it grew louder. He told me the river called to him." "The same hum described by the watchman and our sailor," I murmured. "Precisely," Morcant said. "This man also reported seeing light beneath closed lids when he tried to sleep. A shifting radiance, not like fire or lamp, but like water reflecting an unseen moon. His pulse was irregular. His eyes showed no sign of opium use. His lungs were clear. Yet his hands trembled as though from ague, and his skin bore, in certain lights, a pallor almost translucent." "Did these symptoms worsen?" Holmes asked. "They changed," Morcant replied. As months passed, his fear receded, not because the visions ceased, but because he began to welcome them. He would stand by the Thames for hours, staring into the water, and afterward report feeling calmer, as though some internal pressure had been relieved. When I questioned him, he said the river was easing the resonance. Shortly thereafter, he vanished. His landlady believed he had taken work on another ship. I suspected otherwise. "Suicide," I suggested quietly. Morcant gave a faint, joyless smile. "I no longer use that word easily. The second patient arrived not long after, a navigator from the same vessel. He spoke more openly. He confessed that the ship had altered course to investigate a phenomenon off the northern coast. Lights beneath the tide, sounds through the hull, plants blooming where no sunlight reached. He described them in vivid detail. Filaments like living glass, flowers that opened only when an unseen chord was struck in the deep. He said the crew felt their thoughts, not read exactly, but mirrored. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Mirrored, as in reflected back to them. Yes, Morcant said. He felt his own fears and desires amplified when he stood near the specimens. At first it seemed like an awakening, colors sharper, emotions keener. But then came the headaches, the vertigo, the sense that his own mind no longer fully belonged to him. He begged me for opiates to dull it, though he knew it would offer only temporary respite. "And did he mention Miss Harrogate?" Holmes asked. Morcant nodded. "Often. He said she was the only one aboard who treated the specimens not as curiosities or tools, but as guests. He claimed she spoke to them as one might speak to frightened animals, promising to return them home. When the captain overruled her, she warned him that borrowed light demands repayment. The navigator believed her. It was he who left the anonymous note at the yard, urging intervention when he learned the society had taken custody of the remnants. My heart quickened. He is the author, then. Where is he now? Morcant looked away. He drowned, pulled from the river near Limehouse. The coroner ruled it misadventure under the influence of laudanum. I saw the body before burial. Holmes's voice became very still. And? There were marks upon his skin, Morcant said softly. Not bruises, not lesions. Patterns. Fine, branching lines along his arms and torso, as though some luminous filament had traced its way beneath the surface of his flesh. They had no color in death, but under lamplight they caught the glow in a way normal skin does not. I wrote it off as an artifact of decomposition. He swallowed. I no longer believe that. The room seemed to close in around us. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. "Doctor," I said, "you spoke of several patients. Were there others?" "Two more," Morcant replied. "Both from the same ship, though each took pains to avoid the other in my waiting room. One raved about voices in the glass until I was forced to sedate him. The other spoke hardly at all, but his eyes followed every droplet of water as if it held an intimate threat. Both are gone. One vanished into the river. The other was taken to a private sanatorium at the Society's behest. They claimed they would fund his care. I suspect they funded his silence." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze like a scalpel. "This sanatorium, where is it?" Morcant hesitated. "You must understand, Mr. Holmes, that the men who run the Society hold influence in Parliament, in universities, in institutions that can make or break a physician's career. If I name the place—" Holmes's tone, though quiet, carried a steely undercurrent. "Doctor, the men we speak of have already allowed innocent lives to be consumed by their pursuit. If they succeed, London may face consequences far beyond professional discomfort. You fear for your livelihood. I do not belittle that, but the balance of risk does not favor silence." Morcant met his gaze for a long, deliberative moment. Then he sighed. "Westgate House," he said, "on the outskirts of Hampstead. Officially a retreat for convalescent scholars. Unofficially, a repository for those whose minds have been broken by knowledge. The Society sponsors a wing there. I've referred no one else to them since that man left my care." "Your conscience is sound," Holmes said, "and your courage, I think, sufficient to withstand their displeasure." Morcant gave a humorless laugh. "Courage has little to do with it. Once you have seen what I have seen in those men's eyes, the fear shifts from them to what they may unleash. If you go to Westgate House, you must take care. They will not welcome you." Holmes rose. I would be more concerned if they did. I joined him, though my mind churned with unease. "Doctor," I asked, "one more question. Did any of your patients speak of feeling drawn to the river as Miss Harrogate did?" "All of them," Morcant replied, "to a man. They said the river made the hum bearable, that standing near it was like leaning against a wall in a storm." "And Miss Harrogate," Holmes prompted. He nodded. "She came once. Only once. She listened more than she spoke, but her questions were precise. She asked whether any of the survivors had reported changes in their dreams. When I told her of one who dreamed of drowning without fear, she left abruptly. I never saw her again. There was a finality in his tone that brooked no further inquiry. Holmes thanked him with grave sincerity. As we stepped back out into the fog-choked street, the lamplight seemed harsher than before, as though the city itself were bracing against a chill only some could feel. We walked in silence for several minutes, our breath forming faint clouds. At last I said, "Westgate House. You mean to go there?" "Of course," Holmes replied. "Where else would we find a mind broken not by madness of its own making, but by collision with the same forces that claimed the iridescent and Miss Harrowgate? There may yet be someone alive who can fill the gaps in our knowledge. And if the society bars our way—" A shadow of a smile touched his lips. "Then we shall enter by a door they do not see." I looked toward the dark line of the river, barely visible between the buildings. "Do you truly believe London is in danger? Or are we chasing spectres born of seamen's tales?" Holmes's gaze followed mine. "Danger does not always arrive with fanfare, Watson. Sometimes it seeps. These organisms do not seek conquest. They seek equilibrium. It is man who will attempt to bend that equilibrium for his own ends. That is where catastrophe resides." We turned a corner, and Baker Street's more familiar lamps came into view, their steady glow suddenly precious amidst so much unknown. Yet even there, in the relative safety of our lodgings, I felt an unease that no hearth could banish. We had ventured into waters unseen and returned with only fragments of understanding. Ahead lay Westgate House, and perhaps a mind whose fragments might complete the picture or shatter ours. Holmes, with his usual economy, summed it in a single remark as we mounted our stairs. "Prepare yourself, Watson. We are about to peer through a different sort of glass, and what we see there may not be easily forgotten." We departed for Hampstead shortly after dawn, for Holmes insisted that the sanatorium's staff would be least guarded during the transition between night duties and the more orderly routines of morning. The cab ride carried us steadily northward, the city's familiar architecture giving way to quieter lanes, modest hedgerows, and houses set back behind iron gates softened by ivy. The air felt clearer here, though the clarity held none of the comfort one associates with countryside. Rather, it seemed the crisp stillness preceding some unseen judgment. Holmes sat rigidly beside me, his gaze fixed not upon passing scenery, but upon the horizon of his thoughts. On occasion, he pressed his fingertips together beneath his chin, a posture I had long recognized as the embodiment of his concentrated reasoning. "You are certain we shall gain entry?" I asked. "We shall gain entrance," he corrected. "Whether through the door or otherwise remains to be seen. Our object is not a social call, but intelligence, and intelligence rarely consents to knock politely. Do you anticipate hostility?" Holmes's gaze did not shift. "Hostility is inevitable when truth threatens profit or ambition. In this case, I expect both." The cab turned up a long gravel drive lined with bare oaks, whose branches clawed at the sky like skeletal arms. At the end rose Westgate House, its pale stone facade stately yet austere, adorned with tall windows shuttered on the lower floors. The structure exuded the peculiar elegance of institutions that prize order above comfort, beauty held captive beneath restraint. A wrought iron sign beside the gate bore the name with dignified simplicity. The cabman pulled to a halt. Holmes instructed him to wait at a distance in case we required swift departure. As we approached the entrance, a faint breeze carried the scent of cut grass mingled with some sharper undertone. Chemical, perhaps, or medicinal. A footman in livery opened the door as we mounted the steps. "Good morning, gentlemen. May I inquire as to your business at Westgate House?" Holmes produced a card, freshly printed but entirely fictitious. "Mr. Henry Alton of Edinburgh, accompanying Dr. John Watson." We represent the Royal Medical Society on a matter concerning anomalous neurological cases among seafaring patients. We believe one of your residents may assist." The footman inspected the card, his expression polite yet unreadable. "One moment, if you please." He withdrew through an inner door, leaving us in an entry hall lined with framed portraits of somber men whose achievements seemed less celebrated than catalogued. The hush within the house possessed a quality unlike the silence of normal institutions. It felt curated, as though meant to suppress not only noise, but memory. Moments later, a woman entered, perhaps in her early 40s, dressed in a severe grey gown that suggested both propriety and authority. "I am Mrs. Hawthorne, Superintendent. You seek information regarding a patient?" Holmes bowed faintly. "Information only. We believe the gentleman in question may contribute to broader medical study." She regarded him with a composed smile that did not touch her eyes. "Our residents are here for rest and recovery. We do not grant interviews without explicit consent, and most are not in a condition to provide it. However, I'm willing to ascertain whether any patient recognizes the name you established your inquiry upon." Holmes said, "The vessel, the iridescent." The faintest tightening appeared at the corners of her mouth, barely perceptible, yet enough to confirm our suspicions. "I'm afraid that name means nothing to us," she replied. "If that is your sole inquiry, I fear you have traveled in vain." Holmes did not challenge her directly. "We appreciate your time," he said, though the phrase bore a subtle emphasis that transformed it into a polite withdrawal rather than concession. She inclined her head and gestured toward the door. We might have turned back then, but Holmes's stride slowed as we re-entered the hall, his eyes fixed upon a narrow side corridor partially obscured by a heavy velvet curtain. Something in its shadowed recess arrested him. With the most casual air imaginable, he dropped his gloves, allowing them to fall just beside the curtain's hem. As he stooped to retrieve them, his fingers brushed the fabric aside for the briefest instant. Behind the curtain lay a locked interior door with a brass plaque engraved not with a room number, but a letter. W. Holmes replaced his gloves without comment and led the way outside. Only when the house receded behind us did he speak. "Watson, the corridor concealed a wing restricted from general foot traffic. Wardened corridors are common in facilities housing violent patients. However, the air held no scent of opiates or restraints. It smelled of seawater." "Seawater? Freshly dried?" "Very faint. A residue more suited to docks than clinics. I suspect that wing contains those survivors whose afflictions are deemed too anomalous for standard wards." "Then how do we reach it?" He adjusted his cuffs. "Through the grounds. We shall circle the exterior until we locate a window unsecured by bars. But daylight offers a veneer of legitimacy. Night invites guards. Day invites gardeners." We circled the estate along a hedgerow. At the rear, the building extended into an annex half hidden by yews, with tall windows clouded by condensation. I saw through one, a figure seated in a high-backed chair, facing away from us. His posture was rigid, hands clasped upon his knees as though awaiting instruction. Another figure paced behind him with curiously unsteady gait. Holmes touched my sleeve. We crouched among brambles to observe. The seated man lifted his head, revealing gaunt cheeks and eyes that seemed to gaze beyond the physical world. His skin bore pale, branching marks along the jaw and neck. Not scars, but faint lines that shimmered faintly when light struck them. A nurse approached him, carrying a basin of water. When she placed it upon a table near the window, the seated man's fingers twitched convulsively, his eyes fixed upon the basin with such intensity that I felt a chill despite the mild air. The nurse spoke something inaudible. The man turned away, trembling. I whispered, "That man is afflicted precisely as Morcant described. These are the survivors." Holmes nodded, though his gaze had shifted to the pacing figure. That man wore no marks. yet he muttered constantly under his breath, pacing in jagged arcs like a caged fox. His words drifted faintly through the glass. Not return, not return, not return. Followed by borrowed light, borrowed blood. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The rational mind erodes when language becomes metaphor for experience, he murmured. Their affliction is psychological, not due to weakness, but because comprehension exceeds articulation. We might have remained longer, but the crunch of boots upon gravel reached us. Holmes seized my arm, pulling us deeper into the brush. Two men rounded the building, guards, judging by their posture, though they wore no uniform. One carried a lantern, the other a ledger. "Wing debut," one said, pausing near the window. "The board wants the patients transferred before next week. Transport arranged by river, under cover of night." My pulse quickened. The river again, always the river. The second man replied, "Durrell insists they must be returned. Says the city is listening now. Too many eyes. Too many questions." Holmes's hand tightened slightly on my sleeve. "You heard what happened by Blackfriars, yes? The woman returned herself." "Returned, not drowned." "Returned." The first man spat. "She sealed her pact. Let the depths keep her. Our task is the rest." They moved on. When their footsteps faded, Holmes rose, his expression set with flint-hard resolve. "Watson," he said quietly, "we are no longer merely observers. We stand between the society and their final act of concealment, the return of these men to the very force that unmade them. You cannot mean to intercept them alone." He looked at me, eyes shadowed but unwavering. "I mean to ensure their fate is one of choice, not disposal. We must know what the river intends, and what they intend to consign to it." "And Miss Harrowgate?" I asked softly. Holmes turned his gaze toward the line of distant water, visible through the trees like a serpent of tarnished silver sliding through the city's veins. "If she lives in any form," he said, "the river is no longer merely a place of death. It is an actor. Our next encounter with it must not be in ignorance." A gust of wind cut through the hedgerow, carrying the scent of distant tides. Salt where no salt should be. Holmes exhaled. "Their transfer will happen soon. We must be ready." We left Westgate House as quietly as we had come, yet the knowledge we carried from its hidden wing felt heavier than any fragment of glass or shard of evidence. The river waited, the society prepared, and London, unknowingly, balanced upon a threshold where nature and man contested fate. Our return to Baker Street felt not like retreat, but brief reprieve before a reckoning neither of us yet understood. The following day arrived with a heaviness that seemed to settle upon London like the residue of some unseen storm. Though the sky was a uniform grey, the light it cast over Baker Street felt unnatural, thin, strained, as though even daylight hesitated to pierce the veil of what lay ahead. Holmes had not slept, at least not in any conventional sense. When I rose from a troubled doze in my armchair, I found him standing by the window, his silhouette rigid against the morning haze. He had parted the curtains only an inch, just enough to observe the comings and goings along the street without inviting curious eyes inside. "They move before the next tide," he said without turning. "Everything depends upon reaching the river before the society begins their transfer." "Holmes," I began, "we do not yet know the full extent of what they intend." "On the contrary," he replied quietly, "we know precisely what they intend. Westgate House confirms it. They will return the survivors to the water, not for healing, but for erasure. Their aim is not restoration, but silence." I rose and moved beside him. And what of the patients? Would they even resist? Some seemed scarcely aware of their surroundings. Holmes lowered the curtain and faced me. "The remnants of their will are irrelevant. What matters is that they are men. Men with memories, fears, and perhaps fragments of understanding that must not be drowned in the name of discretion. He crossed the room and began assembling items with a methodical speed. A coiled rope, a small lantern, a tin of waterproofed matches, and a heavy walking stick reinforced with metal along the shaft. The society will not merely escort their charges politely. They will drug them to docility. They will move them under the guise of medical necessity. All will appear civilized, and once they reach the river, civilization ends. You speak as though we shall confront them directly, I said. Holmes paused, one hand resting upon the rope. We shall confront whichever part of them stands between us and truth. I do not relish conflict, Watson, but I must not shy from it. He straightened. We leave at once. We descended into the street, where London's morning bustle already churned with deceptive normalcy. Children hurried with satchels, shopkeepers swept their steps, and carriages rattled along without any hint of the clandestine forces, poised to converge upon the Thames. Holmes hailed a cab, and soon we were carried eastward toward the network of wharves and inlets latticed along the river's edge. As we approached Blackfriars Reach, Holmes asked the cabman to let us down several streets away. Discretion, he murmured, is our ally until the moment it must be shed. The air thickened with the mingled smells of brine, mud, and the coarse smoke of tugboats churning along the river. The tide had begun its slow inward creep, dragging debris from the city's edge toward its center. The water shifted with a peculiar luminosity beneath the surface. Not the vibrant glow we had witnessed the night before, but a subtle shimmer, like moonlight submerged. Holmes moved with careful purpose along a side path flanked by derelict warehouses. He guided me to a vantage point overlooking a concealed landing. There, partially obscured by fog and stacked crates, stood a long covered wagon drawn by two black horses. Several men in dark coats with the society's petal insignia waited beside it. The cover upon the wagon was taut, yet its shape suggested occupants seated within. The transfer begins, Holmes whispered. We watched as two additional men emerged from the wagon's rear and lowered a patient onto a wheeled stretcher. The man was one of the survivors we had glimpsed at Westgate House, the one with branching marks beneath his skin. His head lolled weakly as though sedated. Even in his stupor, his hands twitched toward the river with involuntary yearning. Two more patients followed, their movements equally subdued. In each face I saw a trace of humanity still flickering, fear, resignation, a dim awareness of doom masked beneath the fog of whatever substance had been administered. The servants of the society worked swiftly, barely speaking, their discipline unnervingly precise. Holmes exhaled softly. They have practiced this. What shall we do? I asked. We wait for the final moment, he replied, when concealment gives way to action. The men began lifting the stretchers onto a narrow wooden skiff tethered to the quay. A small engine at the rear sputtered softly as it warmed. It was clear this vessel was no ordinary transport. Its hull had been reinforced with plates, its interior fitted with straps to secure its passengers as though anticipating struggle or transformation. As the third man was strapped in, a fourth stretcher was brought forth. The patient upon it was different, younger, more lucid, his eyes flickering wildly as though struggling to surface from a dream. His mouth moved, trying to form words. The attendants paid him no mind. Holmes's breath sharpened. Now. Before I could respond, he moved. It was not the reckless charge of desperation, but the controlled, silent advance of a predator. I followed, my heart pounding. We descended the steps toward the quay, keeping close to the shadows. Only when we were but a few yards away did Holmes step fully into view. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cold and commanding, "that will be quite enough." The reaction was instantaneous. Several men reached into their coats. Holmes raised his walking stick, not to strike, but to draw all eyes toward the threat he did not need to voice. One of the society agents stepped forward, the insignia gleaming upon his collar. "Mr. Holmes," he said with icy composure, "this is a private medical transfer. You have no jurisdiction here." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "when a man is removed against his will, transported, drugged, and carried toward a river with such haste, jurisdiction is precisely what I invoke." "They are ill," the man insisted. "Their condition is unstable. We are returning them to the environment in which they can be properly contained." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Contained? You mean disposed of? Drowned? Erased?" A murmur passed among the society group. Their leader stiffened. "You understand nothing of the risk these men pose. Their afflictions are contagious, not in the manner of disease, but in influence. If they awaken fully, the resonance they carry can spread. This is mercy, Mr. Holmes." Holmes took a step closer. "Convenience is often mistaken for mercy by men who fear accountability." The society leader's mouth thinned. "Stand aside." Holmes did not move. The tension grew taut as wire. The tide lapped hungrily against the quay, as though the river itself awaited the outcome. The sedated men moaned faintly in their straps, their fingers flexing toward the water with unconscious yearning. Then, without warning, the fourth patient, the lucid one, spoke. His voice trembled, yet rang with raw desperation. "Do not let them take us. Please, please, do not let them send us back. The river is no cure. It is a door." His cry shattered whatever restraint remained. Two society men lunged forward. Holmes sprang aside, striking one across the wrist with his reinforced cane. I grappled with another as he reached for Holmes's throat. The struggle was fierce but brief. The man slipped upon the wet planks, crashing to the ground. The leader barked an order to shove off. The skiff lurched, its engine sputtering as one of the attendants leapt aboard. Holmes dashed forward, seized the mooring rope, and hauled with sudden force. The bow slammed against the quay, jolting the man off balance and knocking the stretcher askew. The patient atop it cried out, the marks upon his skin glowing faintly beneath the strain. And then something changed. The river beneath the skiff pulsed with deep submerged light. The society men froze. Holmes's eyes widened. The water hummed, the same long, resonant note we had heard beneath the arches, but this time it carried a mournful urgency. One of the sedated men stirred, his head lifting with unnatural strength as though answering a summons. The society leader shouted, "Untie the rope!" Holmes retorted sharply, "Watson, cut the engine!" I did not question him. Leaping onto the skiff's stern, I wrenched at the engine's choke. Steam hissed violently, and the machine sputtered into silence. At the same moment, the river surged, not wave, not ripple, but a vertical swell of bioluminescent water that washed over the hull. The patients stilled. The society men stumbled backward in terror. Holmes's voice rang out with steely clarity. "They are not cargo, they are witnesses, and you will not bury them beneath the tide." The society men faltered. The river dimmed. The humming ceased. In the stunned quiet that followed, the patients gasped as though unburdened of some invisible weight. The lucid man collapsed into my arms, trembling. Holmes faced the society leader squarely. "Your transfer's finished, and your silence ends now." But the river was not finished with us. A final tremor rippled beneath the skiff, subtle but unmistakable, like the fading heartbeat of something vast withdrawing into darkness. Holmes stood motionless, listening. Then he looked at me, his expression more grave than I had seen in years. "Watson," he said quietly, "I fear London has not yet heard the last of what lies beneath these waters." Chapter 10 began for us in a hush that did not belong to London at all, but to that strange interval after a storm when the world seems to hold its breath and listen for echoes. The skiff lay half-drawn against the quay, its hull slick with the river's reluctant parting, the sedated men bound upon their stretchers, breathing with the uneven cadence of those returning from some invisible brink. The society's agents stood arrayed before us in a loose semicircle, their faces pale not from cold, but from the dawning realization that the tide of events had turned against them. Holmes broke the silence first, not with accusation, but with a simple, measured statement. "You will accompany us to Scotland Yard," he said. "You will give your accounts under oath, and you will present whatever records you have kept of these experiments and transfers. This matter has advanced beyond the bounds of private discretion." The leader of the society men, his collar still bearing the petal insignia, swallowed hard. "You cannot begin to understand what you interfere with, Holmes. These men are not safe. The resonance they carry is—" "What they carry," Holmes interrupted, "is trauma wrought by your ambition. The danger lies not in their existence, but in your desire to manipulate what they have survived. If there is contagion here, it is moral rather than physical." One of the attendants, younger than the rest and visibly shaken, glanced from the river to the sedated patients with unmistakable distress. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. "He is right, sir. The river did not want them this time. You felt it. The hum, then the silence. It rejected us." The leader turned on him sharply. "Hold your tongue." Holmes's gaze flicked to the young man. "Your conscience will serve you better than any insignia. If you speak truthfully at the Yard, you may yet salvage honor from this business." The distant clatter of hooves upon stone announced the approach of additional company. Holmes had, during a brief moment of confusion, sent a messenger with a hastily scrawled note. Now, at the crest of the ramp, Inspector Lestrade appeared, flanked by 2 constables. His expression, as he took in the skiff, the bound men, and the assembled society agents, betrayed a rare mingling of bewilderment and grim satisfaction. "I might have known you would be in the center of this, Holmes," he said. "Your note mentioned unlawful transport, attempted drowning, and a matter involving certain botanical anomalies of maritime origin. I took it for exaggeration." "For once, my dear Lestrade," Holmes replied, "I fear I understated the case. You arrive in time to prevent a crime whose nature will be difficult to explain, but simple enough to condemn." Lestrade's glance settled upon the society leader. "Name?" "Percival Durrell," the man said stiffly. Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "I know that name. A trustee on more boards than I care to count, including certain committees concerned with public safety. This will not be a quiet business." "It was never going to be quiet," Holmes said calmly. "Only hidden. You may prefer noise to silence in this instance." Lestrade drew a slow breath, then signaled to his constables. "Unstrap the men. They will be removed under police supervision and examined at a secure infirmary. Any attempt to interfere will be treated as obstruction and possibly as conspiracy. As for the rest of you, Mr. Durrell, your presence is requested at the Yard. If you decline, it shall be required." Durrell's shoulders stiffened. "You have no understanding of what you risk by dragging this into public view." "We risk," Lestrade replied, "the possibility that sunlight may accomplish what your secrecy has manifestly failed to do, protect this city. You will have opportunity enough to defend yourself before the magistrate." While the constables moved to release the patients from their cruel straps, I assisted the lucid man, who clung weakly to my sleeve. His eyes, though bloodshot, had regained some clarity. "You heard it," he whispered. "The river turned away. It will not have us. Not yet." "You are safe for the present," I said, though I could not keep all doubt from my voice. "You will be examined and cared for properly." He smiled faintly, the expression tinged with sorrow. "Care is not what we fear, Doctor. It is forgetting. They want us forgotten." Holmes approached, his voice measured. "You were aboard the iridescent." The man's fingers tightened around my arm. "We never meant to bring them up, sir. We only followed orders. The lights, the singing. It felt like an invitation." Miss Harrogate begged the captain to turn back. "Did she believe they could be returned?" Holmes asked. He nodded with visible effort. "She said they were not meant for us. that they were an answer to a question the sea had never asked us to pose. When we reached London, she tried to undo what had been done. The society would not let her. They wanted to own the light. She wanted to bury it. Did she speak of what lay beneath? Holmes said softly. Beyond the lights, beyond the filaments. The man's eyes shone with remembered terror. Not in words I can bear to repeat, sir, only that it was listening, that once it had heard us, it could not entirely forget, not so long as its fragments remained here. Holmes exchanged a glance with me that told me he understood the implications all too well. The man slumped, exhausted, and allowed the constables to support him toward the waiting cart that Lestrade had wisely summoned. The other patients followed, their pallor palpable even in the murky daylight. In the end, there was no dramatic arrest. Durrell accompanied Lestrade with reluctant dignity. His lawyers, I have no doubt, alerted before the cab even reached the yard. Statements were taken. Documents were procured under warrant. The official report spoke of unlawful confinement, experimental treatments lacking oversight, and endangerment of lives through attempted unsanctioned transfer of patients to an unapproved facility. The river was not mentioned, neither were the lights beneath. It was not for want of trying on my part. When called upon to give my account, I spoke plainly of the unusual symptoms, the resonance, the strange glow beneath the Thames. Lestrade listened, pen poised, then looked at Holmes. "You will forgive me," he said, "if I exercise some judgment over what enters the written record. The magistrate's patience has limits, and I do not wish your testimony dismissed as fancy before the substantive charges can be weighed." Holmes inclined his head. "You are correct, Lestrade. There are aspects of this case which will do little to advance justice in a court of law, though they may weigh heavily in a higher tribunal." Lestrade shot me a rueful glance. "There is always something with him, Doctor. Give me men, motives, and means, and I can build a case. Give me humming rivers and glowing fragments, and I am liable to be reassigned to traffic." He closed his notebook. "Still, whatever strangeness lurks beneath your account, the facts suffice. People were in danger. You prevented worse. That will have to do." When at last we returned to Baker Street, the day had already begun to wane. The city, oblivious to how narrowly it had escaped a darker fate, continued its endless routines. Children skipped past our door. A flower seller cried her wares. Somewhere in the distance, I fancied I heard the faint whistle of a train, carrying passengers to destinations untroubled by thoughts of borrowed light and forgotten conservatories. Holmes moved slowly to his armchair and sank into it with an air of fatigue he seldom allowed himself to show. For a time, we neither spoke. The fire cast shifting patterns upon the walls, and the familiar clutter of our room seemed suddenly precious. Chemical glassware, scattered monographs, the violin resting in its corner. At length, I said, "Do you believe it is over?" Holmes's eyes remained upon the flames. "Over, cerne, no. Contained, perhaps. Deferred. Durrell and his colleagues will face inquiry. The society will be forced to alter its methods, if not its ambitions. The men from Westgate House will be spared the river, at least for now. That is the sum of what we have accomplished." "And Miss Harrowgate?" I asked quietly. He did not answer at once. When he finally spoke, his voice was very low. "She stands at the threshold of my mind as she stood at the edge of the Thames, between realms. I do not pretend to know whether she found in those depths the absolution she sought, or merely another form of bondage. I only know that she chose, and that choice must be honored." I hesitated. "Do you regret not reaching her in time?" "Regret," he said, "is an indulgence a detective can ill afford. Yet I confess there is a particular sting in knowing that she faced that moment alone. She carried a weight that might have been shared. Had the world she lived in been more willing to heed the warning of a woman whose science unsettled comfortable minds." He rose then and crossed to the window. Night had begun to creep along the street, and the lamps outside flickered into life one by one, their small circles of light pushing back the darkness with stubborn persistence. Holmes stood there, a thin, solitary figure framed against that modest illumination. "You asked earlier," he said without turning, "whether London is in danger. I shall answer you now as honestly as I may. The city has always been in danger, Watson, of its own ignorance, its own greed, its insistence upon prying open doors it has neither the wisdom to close nor the humility to leave untouched. What lies beneath the Thames will not rise unbidden so long as we cease sending down our hooks of curiosity and ambition. The question is not whether the depths mean us harm, but whether we can refrain from manufacturing that harm by meddling." "And do you think we can?" I asked. He was silent for some moments. Then he drew the curtains together with a decisive motion, shutting out the street. "It is not for me to say," he replied. "I am but an observer, and, when fortune favors, an intercessor. Yet I will tell our unseen listeners this, Watson." He turned finally, and his gaze met mine with quiet intensity. "If ever again the glass of a forgotten conservatory shatters where it should hold firm, if the river hums beneath a moonless sky, if men speak in whispers of lights blooming where no sun has ever shone, then let them remember that the line between knowledge and calamity is drawn by conscience, not by discovery. And let them attend to such stories, not dismiss them as mere tales." I felt in that moment that he was not speaking solely to me. He addressed some wider circle, the future readers of my case notes perhaps, or the unseen audience to whom all chroniclers secretly appeal. In my mind's eye I saw again the skeletal frame of the conservatory at Kensington, its shattered panes glistening with dew, the violet-stained shards arranged like a pattern not meant for human comprehension. Later that night, when Holmes had retired at last, and the house had sunk into its usual stillness, I stepped softly to the window and drew the curtain aside. The sky above London was overcast, hiding any stars that might have offered comfort. Yet in the distance, beyond the chimneys and rooftops, I could just discern the faint curve of the Thames as it wound through the city's heart like a band of dull metal. I listened. No hum disturbed the air. No unnatural glow pulsed beneath those dark waters. The river, for the time being, kept its counsel, and I, with pen in hand and memory still raw, began to set down the tale of the glass of the forgotten conservatory, and of the borrowed light that nearly turned London into a reflection of something it was never meant to mirror.